Hey, folks, welcome back to another bonus episode. This week we're talking to Chris Knotts. Chris, do you want to just introduce yourself real quick, let people know who you are and why people like you, and then we can get into DevOps and learning and some of the things that we were going to talk about here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charles. So my name's Chris Knotts. I am a learning practice director for a company called Cprime. Cprime is a consulting agency, and we basically focus on enterprise coaching and technology learning delivery. So we do some other things as well, some managed services and things like that. But primarily, we're really trying to help very large bureaucratic type organizations embrace the shift left and to adopt better engineering patterns and better technology workflow patterns. So anything on the value stream that is impacted by that, we probably have something with. So my focus is on specifically skills and adoption of new behavior patterns and quite a bit of tool training as well.
Right, that makes sense. Just to give you a little background that I have. So way back early in my career, I worked for EMC Corporation, which was a huge company that did hardware and stuff. More recently, I worked for Morgan Stanley, which is a large financial firm, and just worked on a little. It was almost a side project of a side project, and yeah, it's interesting to talk about some of these ideas around training companies and shift left and how you do some of this stuff when. If I was working on something important, it seemed like they were dictating all the root things to me. And if I was working on something that was kind of not their central focus, then we'd have to beg for what we needed. So I'm curious, do you handle some of the management practices around that and the way that they handle that? Or is that mostly down to the individual contributors?
No, we do handle that. So, for my area in particular, we have workshops and strategy sessions and executive enablement, things like that. People that are often outside of the direct technology lane, if you will, because we know that those types of sponsors and those types of leaders are folks who need to, help manage expectations and understand the type of backing and sponsorship that their teams need and things like that. So that's a big area of focus for us in particular, just sort of, from a leadership standpoint, from a management standpoint, whether it's, management constructs or just mindset and sort of the general culture that they set the tone for. That's way outside of really sort of infrastructure teams or developer teams or anybody who's dealing with technology. But I mean, our customers are all really kind of large, like dare I say, enterprise type customers. Right. So there's a lot of layers of management there. I mean, there's a lot of bureaucracy there. There's a lot of resistance to change. And there's honestly, I mean, there's a lack of literacy as well, just outside of sort of the teams that care about DevOps and these lean engineering patterns. So yeah, we have a lot of content on that. We've got a lot of really cool coaches who deal with those types of people.
That makes sense. I might have jumped the gun a little bit because I think what people who are listening to this show want to know, besides, can you help my boss? is so how do you start to evaluate what people want to learn or need to learn, identify the weaknesses in their process, help build some of that DevOps culture and things like that? Like, where do you start with all of these things?
Yeah, well, I mean, we always start by trying to meet the customer where they are. And there's a number of different entry points into the conversation that people will approach us with, depending on what their role is, or where they are, what their project is, or what their background is. I mean, we feel like,
or what hurts.
Yeah, for sure. And different people have different pain points, but starting at the pain point is a tried and true priority for me. Yeah. I think that works well. I hope that can I drop names on here? How rude is that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Go ahead.
So I say this only because I'm a huge admirer, and one of my biggest role models is Jez Humble. And your audience obviously will know who he is, but he's always kind of emphasizes start with the people's pain and minimize that pain
Hmm.
and sort of address it as early and often as you can. And I think that's a great rule, as well as just sort of helps to reveal the lowest hanging fruit from an ROI perspective, right? I mean,
Yep.
wherever the constraints and bottlenecks are always going to be where the pain points show up, and that's also just logically where you should start, with addressing the flow. So yeah, that's a huge point for me. Yeah.
Right. So then, and this is a question that I get asked on all kinds of technical topics is, okay, so what do I do next? Or what do I learn next? Where do I push in next? And I know that some of this is specific to what my pain is or what my position is, or, some of the considerations that you pointed out. But, um, yeah, once you kind of get an idea of what people are dealing with, then yeah, how do you help them understand, okay, these are the next few steps that we need to take in order to either understand the problem better or solve it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for me, it's kind of it's always, for one thing, we want to get to yes with the person that we're engaged with in
Hmm.
conversation, and so that conversation, again, it's going to be different, right? Some people are really hot for a tool, and they just want to talk about the tool, and I mean, this is a common thing, and we don't punt on the tool conversation. We're always happy to talk about those tools, but we try to go ahead and start framing that conversation around the larger story, the larger almost worldview, if you will. And the worldview is, it's not really about tools first, obviously. I mean, the worldview
Right.
is about, it's about value and people and flow, and really, I mean, think to me, importantly, the relationship between humans and machines, and
Hmm.
how we find good working relationships between those things. And it's also obviously a conversation about, quality of life, and what is valuable and what's valuable to you in your life as well as with your work. And these are all things that are kind of abstract, but they do inform the worldview, and we've got a fairly well defined worldview there. So we start to try to talk about those things. Sometimes, especially if you're outside of a technology team, people are receptive to large strategic themes. Sometimes even like there might be like a macroeconomic discussion there, around technology adoption rates or why it's important. A lot of times people outside of technology teams don't even always have a good sense for, what are the macro trends, and does it matter, or why should I care?
Hmm.
So we really love to talk about that stuff, because for one thing, that stuff in some ways is the most fun, because it's the most fundamental. And but for another thing, if you align on those things, then it helps you to define all of the other things which are subsequent to it. So hopefully that answers the question. But I mean, if you're talking to somebody from an enterprise PMO, that's going to be a different set of topics that they're interested in, versus a DBA. And then that in turn
Right.
is going to be a different set of topics to somebody who's a product owner or some manager or executive somewhere. So, but the worldview has a place to engage with all of those types of roles.
Hmm.
So we always kind of start to try to establish the frame, no matter which type of person we're talking to, and that's fun. And it also kind of starts to give us a little bit of a roadmap for how we can make the conversation relevant to that person and where they sit, but also maybe pushing them a little bit on perspective from outside where they sit.
Right. So it's interesting to me, just looking at this, and okay, what? Yeah, what's your worldview? What are we basing things on? Um, I typically don't see people leave their jobs because of a tool, right? It's usually because there's some misalignment with the worldview or the way that they execute things or things like that. And so these are the problems that people want solved. I'm I'm kind of curious, and this might get a little bit more into the meat of things, but where do you see the processes generally fall apart, or where do you see the processes generally cause pain for the people who are trying to use them?
Well, sure, it's a great question. Gosh, I mean, I think there's a few different ways you could answer that, but I think I would revert back to this idea of the human factors. So
Hmm.
what do I mean when I say human factors? I think what I mean is, factors like trust, for instance, or
Hmm.
fear, and these are things that they have a surprisingly practical set of consequences if you look at them. I mean, a lot of the classic DevOps conversation is around incentives and alignment of incentives and things like that. And I think right from the early days, what you see is that when there's fear at play, it really colors the incentives in a bad way. And it
Hmm.
colors the incentives in a way that prevent you from aligning the type of things that you need from a process standpoint, from a flow standpoint, and things like that to be able to achieve the promise that we're so interested in. As well, factors like trust on the positive side, or the ability to kind of be brave or take risks. You want to
Hmm.
find ways to bake those sort of human factors right into the business process, in the job description, because those are the things that are ultimately going to press forward into value creation, and value creation is what we're primarily interested in. That's where I would start, and then obviously there are certainly process specific things that you can talk about, just as there are tool specific things. But, it's worth a conversation with people just to kind of take their temperature on, are people afraid to try new things on your
Hmm.
team? Or, are people, are incentives such that there's a need to cover your butt on stuff rather than you feel empowered, you're not going to get your hand slapped if you just you have a cool idea and you try it, and we can worry about scaling it later or something like that. I mean, it's a line that you have to skirt, because I mean there are very real concerns around security and compliance and things like that. Like, controls are a good thing, we don't want to throw that
Hmm.
out the window, but you got to find ways to bake in these sort of positive, forward-leaning, almost emotions, from the team standpoint.
Right. Well, and I've definitely worked at places where, yeah, the lack of trust basically boiled down to political gamesmanship, and or people wouldn't play as hard as they could because they were worried that somebody was going to come in behind them and knock them down or mess them up or whatever. And so you had to kind of walk or try and run and make sure that nobody was coming in to swoop in and cause you issues. And yeah, that goes a long way. But yeah, it is in almost all the cases that I see where software has a problem, it boils down to the human stuff, right? I mean, sometimes it's regulatory or technical things, but most of the time, if people feel safe going out there and trying to do the right thing, then yeah, you make a ton more progress because they're not afraid to try new things or afraid to ask a question when they have it or things like that. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
totally
I
feel that.
mean, it's a heady brew, right? But like, it's
Yeah.
generally based on precedent. I mean, people usually have good reason. There's usually a historical aspect to these things, and
Hmm.
people will judge what they anticipate based on what has already happened. And so if what has already happened demonstrates that there's risk there, and there's not a safety culture, there's not psychological
Hmm.
safety.
Right.
As an aside, I should say, I think psychological safety is, I believe, starting to be a more relevant topic just in the commercial world that we work in,
Hmm.
which is pretty cool. But there's kind of a rising awareness, I think, that factors like that are pretty important.
Right.
Pretty important to retention and good team dynamics and things like that. But I mean, I don't know. It's a recent development, and it's just something I've noticed. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
No, absolutely. And I think we're also seeing companies be rewarded for it, right? Where yeah, then somebody comes in with an idea and they're not wondering, am I going to get my head handed to me if I bring this up, right? I know this is the answer to the problem or an answer to the problem, but or this is a way that we could move forward more quickly or whatever. Yeah. And just,
Yeah.
feeling like even if it's not the direction we go in, I'm not going to be punished for bringing it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um I'm kind of curious though, as we kind of get into this and some of these human factors, how do we get those to translate back into some of the technical things? You talked about tools or technologies or ways of approaching those things. Um, because usually there's some aspect of that people are trying to solve, right? And you solve some of it with the people and the way that people work and the way that people feel about their work, and then some of it you have to solve with the technology or the tool.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, in some ways, the technology of the tool is where the rubber hits the road.
Right.
So it's not going to work well if you don't have these human factors dealt with. But I mean, I'm not suggesting that you don't have really detailed conversations about tooling or the
Hmm.
technology as well. And in some ways, it's like if you can get the human factors sorted out, that then the technology is the fun part, because the
Right.
the technology is where you have all of these amazing power tools that allow you to force multiply your intentions. So once the intentions are in order, and you've kind of got that stuff under your belt. Now let's play with the power tools, and that's fun.
Hmm.
It's not fun if somebody gets hurt because they don't know how to use a power tool, and there's not a good safety protocol there. But once you have that and you're skilled and you know what you're doing,
Hmm.
then you can get a lot of amazing things done with a good set of power tools, right? So I think you definitely want to always tie things back to, all right, what's the technology implementation?
Right.
But to answer your question directly, I mean, I would think, all right, if we're thinking about if we're backing into the tool conversation from the human factors conversation, we've talked a little bit about ingredients like fear and psychological safety and bravery and
Hmm.
executive sponsorship and things like that. All right, what do those have to do with technology implementation? Well, I think for one thing, this could be its own episode, so I won't get into detail. But I
Yeah.
think I think you could start with some of those things and say, okay, if those things are true, then from an organizational perspective and from a job description and a business process perspective, how do we translate the types of incentives that we want to cultivate, the type of
Hmm.
brave culture that we want to cultivate? All right, what do job descriptions and business processes look like that support that? And you can do
Right.
that. And I mean, I spent years thinking about kind of abstract concepts like fundamental values, and like organizational culture. And it was like, oh, the best organizations who win the most are the ones who have these high performing cultures. And I was like, okay, well, great, but what if you don't have that? I mean, is there
Right.
is there is there something that you can do to actually change that? And it took some time, but I mean, I think the answer in the end was actually there are things that you can do, and that touches leadership, obviously, and things like
Hmm.
that. But there are certainly, if you are on a road to cultural maturity so that you can do better with technology, yes, there's things that you can do, right? So we'll just
Right.
leave it at that. But and then we get a step closer to an engineering conversation, and certainly in a very complex organization, there's room to have process engineering and business process design discussions, and let's come together and
Hmm.
design business processes that support that. And you keep on, always with an eye towards shifting left, right? Always with an
Right.
eye towards the setting up of feedback loops, right? And you
Hmm.
don't wait until you have the people who are holding the power tool have their work order in hand to get their feedback.
Right.
You want to make sure their voice is present from a design standpoint and from a logic standpoint. So ideally, all of this process design and things like that are being informed by uh, downstream people who are going to be the ones who, for
Hmm.
one, they're going to be the ones to catch the compound interest on either negative or positive feedback, or business process. So anyway, so you have those folks hopefully informing design decision, and then when it comes to tools in particular, I mean, I think we're living in kind of this cool moment where there's a lot of really amazing tools who have been designed sort of almost like by the people for the people who understand these concepts, and so the tools
Hmm.
are the tools are designed to support that type of thing. And so you can select tools to that degree or whatever, but I mean you can also select tools that people want to use. You can tie those things to business value certainly very easily, and then
Hmm.
you can look for things that save people time or are fun, or allow them to more quickly get from idea to value or to test things in a safe
Hmm.
way, things like that. So I mean, those all become tooling and tech conversations very quickly.
Right.
And then the final thing I would say is some of the things a topic that I like the most and is the most fun when it comes to technology is just kind of, what's emergent, like what's getting all the press
Hmm.
and what's getting, where's the gold rush, and how valid is there
Right.
truly gold in them thar hills? Like, let's talk about that. And if there is, let's talk about the nature of that value. And engineers and technologists, I think, enjoy learning, and they enjoy staying
Hmm.
on the forefront of what's going on in the tech world, and they're really tuned into it. And that can translate to tremendous value in your job. So that's kind of how I would start to approach the tooling conversation, and then from there, you really ultimately got to talk to the people who are doing the work before you talk about specific tools or how they use them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, I mean, initially we started talking about some of the ideas around the technologies and tools, and then we moved into the people things, and then coming out of that, yeah, what I'm seeing is you're connecting the dots with not just what problem do we need solved, but how are we approaching solving it? What kind of culture, what kind of process do we have, and then what tools actually support that? And then I'm looking at it and I'm going, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And then we're not picking the tool and struggling through it because it's not designed for the way we're going to work, and we're doing that because we didn't have the conversation and we didn't think about the way we were going to work in the first place. And so having the feedback mechanisms and things like that, again, it kind of all ties together. And one thing that you said that I kind of want to back up on a little bit is you said with a focus on shifting left and having good feedback and things like that. So, what are those kind of overarching principles that you have to have as you start looking at your people and your process and your tools to make sure that you're getting some of the fundamentals in place so that you can either do it right or not walk into some of the buzzsaws that are out there that you can run into?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a great question. And I think I'm always a little gun shy about trying to stuff my sentences full of buzzwords, which is a really hard thing to avoid. But I
Right.
will just come right out and say it. And I will say it's a lot of things. It's something that a lot of commercial customers are actually quite interested in, and they're ready to believe and benefit. But that is that you really have to get your head around your value streams. And that,
Hmm.
I think, would be the first thing.
So when you say value streams, is that like revenue streams or is that something else?
Well, now that's a really good question. So there's different types of value streams, and you run into this. From a DevOps point of view, I think that the way that we've approached the idea of value streams is that it's a bit of a process map where you're trying to identify waste, or you're trying to identify opportunities for improvement.
Hmm.
But it is it can be a fairly tightly sequenced engineering map of how the work flows through the IT organization.
Okay.
So that's one flavor of value stream, and that's the flavor that I was introduced to when I first got engaged in the DevOps community years ago. The idea kind of from a lean perspective.
Hmm.
You would take this lean value stream mapping idea sort of and apply this VSM idea to IT workflows. This is not a new idea, right? So I'd be
Right.
surprised if your audience hasn't heard this a million times. But the interesting thing is that there the idea of value streams has been I almost want to say co-opted by other areas of there's certifying bodies and management framework organizations out there who have written the concept of value streams into their frameworks as well. But there's an idea that you're talking about a tactical value stream if you're looking at the IT level. You're
Hmm.
talking about time cycles and waste and how quickly something can get done, and that's fairly easy to understand. But if you move up in the organization from that, a lot of times those types of teams represent shared services, and
Hmm.
they're getting hit with all kinds of intake, and a lot of times for whether there's a good excuse for it or not, a lot of customers, especially at the technology level, they don't have good processes to juggle this type of intake and to apply like economic rubrics to their decision making, so they can really have
Hmm.
a prioritization techniques and things like that that make sense from a unified system-wide perspective. A lot of times they do the best they can, they prioritize the best they can, but there's not necessarily like an officially blessed system of prioritizing. So in order to do that type of prioritization, I mean, for one thing, you need like your teams and your organization's economic rubric so that you can apply that type of economic judgment to it. And only you guys can come up with that, right? Like, I mean, we can give you some places to start. There's some examples out there, but ultimately you need an economic set of criteria that works for your folks, right? So in that spirit, as you start to determine, all right, well, now we're a little bit outside of the technology department if we're going to come up with those rubrics and if we're going to come up with ways to prioritize from an economic point of view. So that's a business conversation. That's not a technology conversation. And so in our commercial customers, a lot of times they deal with that type of work management with a PMO or with a program management practice, or often with a portfolio management practice, or with a framework or whatever. So, but there's huge ranks of people whose job it is just to deal with that type of stuff. And this is sometimes what again I've heard Jez Humble refer to as the fuzzy front end. If you're dealing with the upstream business analysis type functions, the mushy middle, you hear that term sometimes. Right. But basically, these are management conversations, and these are product management conversations too. At least right now they are. Sometimes there's a project management component as well. Although we see a big trend in industry to start orienting these value streams away from the idea of projects and towards the idea of products, and that's a big thing for us. Cprime specializes in how to do this as well. But anyway, at some point, all of the work that's going to flow through these shared services and needs this prioritization logic applied to it and things like that, at some point you really would like to think that there's a unified logic that determines what is going to get the most investment. What ROI do we expect from that? What's the priority? I mean, we can't do it all at once. And there's more ideas than you can shake a stick at about how to realize value. So you need to be able to have mechanisms in place to validate those value propositions. Is just somebody's pet project, or it's a bee in their bonnet that somebody thinks is going to be the next big thing, and they have power in the organization. So now they're championing this, but there really hasn't been any rigor applied to validating the value proposition, and that, as you can imagine, like that leads to a lot of waste. So anyway, to tie it off, the idea is to have good portfolio management in a way that is also lean. It's the same core principles that we would associate with DevOps, but instead of being applied explicitly to just the technology teamwork, it's being applied to product decisions, strategic decisions, and things like that at the management level and at the portfolio level.
Right. So I kind of derailed you answering my question, but I think it was worth it because just understanding, where you can really get some bite on your processes and where the value is and what you can where the value essentially comes from your organization. It makes a lot of sense. But so going back to the original question, what are these overriding principles then that we need to focus on in order to maximize these value streams?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess if you really wanted a good place to start, and again, your audience is probably super familiar with this, but it's the old idea of the theory of constraints. It kind of gets back to your pain point. Said point twice. The pain point that you made earlier. But identifying the constraints is where you have an opportunity to unlock greater capacity and to increase your flow. So, again, just as you would need to have rubrics in place to sort of identify value and gauge value and to prioritize, you would like to have rubrics in place to be able to identify constraints. So that's where I would start. And then from there, I guess I have to say that the constraints usually look pretty similar, or at least they often fall into a small family of themes. So when we engage with somebody to start to look at what those core principles are, we always kind of start out of the box with these common themes, and we we'll talk about those. 9 times out of 10, one of those themes is very interesting and resonates with our customer, and so now
Mm-hmm.
you're having a conversation about that. But and then from there you can get into more detailed conversations about identifying opportunities for automation and things like that. And there's just gazillions of opportunities for that right now. So does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm. I think so. So just kind of coming back to this last idea, and that is, I mean, a lot of the things we're talking about, I've seen some companies that seem to do them really well, and some of them that really don't. And so, you mentioned that you're in this training and education arena around these ideas. And so, if let's say that I'm somebody who doesn't understand some of these ideas, or I'm hearing what you're saying and it seems like the next step may make a lot of sense, but the one after that I'm just not sure where to go. So what resources are out there for people to get trained up, or to learn about this, or to get ideas of things that they can do to, maximize their value streams, and deliver for the company that they're working in, and make sure that all of their customers are satisfied, and that we're moving in the right direction to make all of this work.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's tons of resources out there. I think the first thing I would say is it really behooves you, if you're in that type of a position, to embrace your sense of curiosity, right? That being curious is almost a prerequisite, because if you want someone to prescribe resources to you or learning, then I think you're already a step behind from sort of your the core place that you want to be, which is that you want to be interested and curious, and you want interested, curious people making up your teams. But from there, I mean, I think this is a heavily personally biased list,
Hmm.
obviously, but I've got some of my favorite thought leaders that I like to follow. Again, happy to share those if you want. But some of these folks have been really influential, in their books, I think have been indispensable. So, I definitely would encourage people to read. If you're talking about a truly novice type of person who maybe doesn't have a whole lot of exposure to where we are with DevOps in 2023, then certainly you want to read all of Gene Kim's books, and you'd want to read
Right.
Jez Humble's books. Get on YouTube and look up Jez's keynote talks that are on there. That honestly is some of the coolest content that I've encountered. Also the book that Barry O'Reilly and Joe Molsky and Jez Humble wrote, Lean Enterprise, a couple years ago. That's been it's been more than a couple now, I guess. But it's a not a long read, but it's fantastic, and I think it addresses a lot of these questions that we're talking about in a very practical way. Both the tech questions and the human factors questions. Another really cool person that I really have enjoyed learning about more, and he has at least last time I checked, he has a whole collection of essays that he has written, which have been super illuminating for me. But that's Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator.
Hmm.
Yeah, love the way Paul thinks about things, especially when it comes to kind of making bets on value and making investment decisions. And a lot of it actually informs that portfolio conversation about how do you decentralize risk in a portfolio and generate a higher assurance of value return from an aggregated level by managing a portfolio of many small bets, versus sort of what Paul's VC peers did back when. I mean, I think there's a lot of incubators and things these days, but when Y Combinator came to the game, there weren't a lot of VC motions that looked like that. It was kind
Right.
of like big bets and investors who were really all up in the product, and really wanted a lot of front end definition around the TAM and the market
Hmm.
segment and what the product was and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And, that works. I mean, people have made a lot of money doing that or whatever. But I just thought that it makes a lot of, if you're let's say you're in just a normal technology job, well, you can't, you can essentially you can't replicate anything about that conventional VC behavior in the way you manage your own products or the way that you take new features out. But you can learn
Right.
from Paul Graham's way, right? Like there's a lot of really practical stuff there about how you manage and scale and innovate. So Paul Graham for sure. PaulGraham.com. He's got his essays there, or at least last time I checked. But those are binge worthy essays, I'd say. I could go on, but those are a few examples.
Awesome. We're kind of getting toward the end of our time, so I guess the other question is if people want training from Cprime, or to reach out to you and ask you questions. I mean, what's the best way to approach that?
The easiest thing is probably just to go to cprime.com. There's a real person behind our live chat there, or you can email us. We're certainly on LinkedIn or whatever. But yeah, cprime.com is the best place. Just go there and you can hit us up in the chat. I know all the people who man the live chat. They're colleagues of mine for a long time, and they can get you in touch with me. And or you can find me on cprime.com and just reach out. It's perfectly fine.
All right, sounds good. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap us up. But this was fun, and I think we explored a lot of areas that people struggle in, and so yeah, hopefully we can help identify some of those and give people ideas of where to go to get help.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Can I ask you a question before we adjourn?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
I've mentioned a couple times that sometimes I feel like I'm trotting the treading path on some of these concepts, although they're still quite valid. But I'm curious from your
Mhm.
point of view. Are there what are the things that your audience is most interested in these days? Especially things that might be newer topics of conversation.
Right. So I run this podcast network of all of the different shows. Adventures in DevOps is one. Most of the other shows focus on software development practices. And so what's interesting is when we talk about shift left, it depends on who I'm talking to
Mm.
and what their position is and what their concerns are, right? And what I see, especially in this area, is that some companies do this really, really well, right? They integrate the dev and the DevOps, and because most of the people I talk to are developers, not DevOps folks, right? But by having that well integrated, by having the feedback loops, by having the clear delineation of how we do things in these processes and the things that we've talked about, what they wind up doing is it makes everybody's job easier, and it makes it so that we understand where the concerns are, right? So if I'm a developer and I'm working with a DevOps engineer, I can understand the concerns that they're trying to solve. And if I'm a DevOps engineer, I can understand the kinds of things that the developers are concerned with and the directions they may move in. And so that's kind of the appeal to me, is that if I can bridge that gap, that really helps. Now, as far as like hot topics that I'm hearing about, a lot of it really just comes down to I think people are talking about AI a lot. Some people are talking about how AI can actually like manage infrastructure and solve some of the getting back to tools, right? Solve some of these issues or solve some of our scaling problems or whatever, and make that move forward. But the thing that's interesting about it is that I don't see a lot of the conversations about how do we decide if this is the way to go, or how do we decide if this is going to fit with our process? How do we decide if this is actually going to be more help than not? And I think it's a changing landscape. The other thing I hear people talking about some is just our tools are not perfect. And so, whether you're using Kubernetes or you're pushing to, AWS or something else for your infrastructure, right? Or whether you're using GitHub or Bitbucket or something like that for your code, or whether so all the different tools that come into parts of our process. I hear people talking about some of the deficiencies of some of these tools and how to solve them, and that's always interesting, right? And what I find is the companies that seem to do the best are the ones that have those conversations, like we talked about here. And then it's like, okay, well, you know what solves our problem now and what is coming, because GitHub keeps innovating things. GitLab, I see innovating things. Some of these other companies are innovating in different areas, and so we're going to keep an eye on it, and we know about where we want things to land, right? What problems we want it to solve for us, and then, how does it do it? But um, it's fascinating to me also just from the standpoint of what changes and what doesn't, right? A lot of the DevOps movement came out of the agile development movement. And so you see a lot of those parallels in the way that we work. And some companies, it's completely haphazard, and some companies really get it. And sometimes the conversation is just around how hard it is to get work done because they're not really adopting some of the people solutions, and they're looking for their tools to solve them. And I see a ton of those conversations. How do we blah, blah, blah? We're using these tools. And the answer is you've got to give your people a vision, get them on board, help them understand what you need them to do, help them understand how it fits into the broader scheme of things in the company. And all of that stuff is hard. And so, yeah, just solving those things. But yeah, I think the really hot things are just in the areas of either what new hot tool is coming out that's going to make some process easier, and tangential to that is the AI conversation and if, when, and how it's going to make a difference.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The AI conversation obviously is, there's that gold rush I mentioned earlier was kind of the one I had in mind.
Yep.
But I've been engaged with the AI community since about 2002, so about 20 years now.
Oh, wow.
Before it was quite so mainstream, and from a DevOps perspective, engineers have been integrating quite a bit of AI and AI-ish type stuff. ML ops and things like that, for a number of years now, so it's this generative AI and, the promise of these LLMs that really is like blowing up and getting all the press right now. But, and that it is an inflection point just because of the incredible accessibility that all of a sudden has been unlocked for people. Yeah, the generative AI thing is something that's a conversation that, we're heavily engaged in here. And, I've actually used my GPT-4 account to craft like some canvassing tools to find some of those constraints and opportunities to use LLM instances internally to find where can you save the most time, where can you attack the lowest hanging constraint, and that stuff is really fun. So anyway, obviously generative AI and these LLMs are like flavor of the day, but rightfully so.
Yep. Yeah, and you mentioned ML ops, and it's funny because that kind of brings it back full circle, right? Is what can machine learning do for us? But we have a machine learning show on Top End Devs, Adventures in Machine Learning, and yeah, I mean, it's funny because we do talk about the algorithms and we talk about large language models, but the vast majority of the stuff we're talking about is for ML practitioners, and it's about ML ops and data management. And so just bringing it back, right? These things apply back to how we run these things in the first place. And a lot of times that's not trivial either because the pipeline changes as we get new data sources or new information or new ways of understanding the data we already have. And so then we have to update our ML ops pipeline, and we have to be flexible enough to take advantage of that. And then we have to work it back into that value pipeline that you were talking about earlier, right? Into, okay, how are we doing this? How are we doing this better? How are we, solving some of these problems? How are we breaking things down and putting them back together? And anyway, it's really fascinating because I can see how it all connects.
Absolutely, yeah, it's super interesting.
Yep.
Well, I know you appreciate the time here, so I didn't mean to send us on another tangent, but I can do tangents all day long. So if you ever have a hankering, just give me a call, man.
Me too. I do tangents all day. I mean, I have to go get ready for another thing here in another 10 minutes, but yeah, it's and that's the really fun part of this is like, okay, here's the high level stuff. Okay, now what's this layer underneath, and how do we do that better?
100%.
So, all right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thanks for coming, Chris.
Yep. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
All right. Till next time, folks. Max out.